Good evening and welcome to the VPR Gubernatorial Debate. I'm Jane Lindholm and I'm joined in VPR's performance studio by Bob Kinzel.
Well, tonight we invited the major party candidates for governor, incumbent Democrat Peter Shumlin and his Republican challenger, Randy Brock. The Progressive Party nominee is still undetermined, but we will offer the winner of that primary an opportunity to outline their priorities to our listeners at a later date.
The candidates have agreed to our format, which includes some time guidelines. They've agreed to wrap up their statements when they see their time is running out, and if they don't, we will gently remind them.
And in this first round of the debate, Jane and I will pose questions to the candidates.
Tropical Storm Irene is 1 year in the past, but the knock-on effects of the storm are still very much with us and remain an overarching concern for many Vermont families and communities. Homeowners and municipalities continue to wrestle with FEMA over funds to repair or rebuild damaged structures. The state of Vermont finds itself in much the same position in Waterbury, with the future of the state office complex and workspace for the Agency of Human Services at stake, as well as the construction of a new state hospital in Berlin. Randy Brock, you have been critical of Governor Shumlin's dealings with FEMA in the last couple of months. The governor says he's confident that FEMA will come through with the necessary funds to see his plan to fruition. Do you agree that FEMA is a good partner? And what would you do differently if you find yourself dealing with the agency in January?
FEMA is probably at this point a predictable partner because it's behaving with Vermont the same as it's behaved with other states who also have faced similar disasters. The issue is our contingency plan and how well prepared we are to deal with what appear to be interminable delays from FEMA, and whether or not we've adequately planned for a worst-case scenario. That is, in the event that the amount that we get from FEMA, which does seem to be likely to be significantly lower than what was anticipated originally, how well prepared we are to continue and to institute a corrective strategy without harming our economy, without harming our bond rating, and whether or not we have a contingency plan that makes sense. It's clear that we delayed in getting a contingency plan until I called for one in January in a press conference, and that, I think, was a mistake.
Well, in that case, what is your contingency plan? What would be? I mean, you're going to have to deal with this on the ground very quickly if you're elected. So what is your plan for AHS, for the Waterbury office complex, and for the state hospital, and how would you fund it?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. The key is whether or not it's wise to go ahead with an elaborate plan that involves the construction of new buildings while there is still the uncertainty as to whether or not we would get the funding. So the first thing that I would do is determine where the funding would come from in order to create the plan that we start and move forward on. The second thing that I would do is determine how to bridge the gap in the interim, either through the use of alternative facilities for some employees for a longer period of time until we have real assurance that we can pay for it. The worst thing that we could do is to move forward blindly on a theory of trust me, it will all work out, without doing the true contingency planning that you need to do fiscally. I've done this in the private sector. That was my principal job, among other things, in my last permanent employment, and I know how essential it is to have a plan before moving forward.
But you don't have a plan right now?
I do have a plan in broad outline terms, but I do not have the Department of Buildings and Services. I do not have the funding to hire architects. I do not have the things that government has and that government ought to be doing. As a challenger, it's not my job to create detailed economic and building plans to replace, but it is my job to say these are the broad policies that we should follow in order to get to that result. The broad policies are to do a contingency plan that takes into account the worst case probability and then determines how we will fund it, determines how much we will need in order to build either A, the complete project as we want to, the so-called Plan B as it was designed, and then in the event that we don't have enough money, that we can't raise it through bonding without damaging our bond rating, then how far can we realistically go on the funding that we can realistically raise without harming that bond rating?
Of course, time is of the essence. Do you agree with the governor's emphasis and setting a priority on building a new state hospital in Berlin now before we have the funding from FEMA?
Well, I think it's important to move forward, but it is important to move forward prudently. We can be bold And no one can criticize a governor for being bold, but there's a point in which being bold also can be being reckless. Not knowing where you're going to get the money to do something, I think, goes beyond being bold. I want to hear a clear plan. I was at the governor's news conference today in which he outlined some possible approaches to dealing with a worst-case scenario. But what I heard was essentially a back-of-the-envelope proposal, and I heard a lot of trust me. And I'm real concerned when I hear things like that because it lacks the degree of precision that I think we ought to have in a contingency plan.
Just yes or no, would you break ground on a state hospital before the end of the year?
Only if I knew how I was going to pay for it. If I did not know how I was going to pay for it, I wouldn't break ground on something without knowing where the money is coming from.
Governor Shumlin, turning to you, what seemed to be a promise of that money from FEMA turned out to be a lot more uncertain as we moved through this process. You did hold a press conference today during which you reiterated your belief that we will ultimately get close to the $120 million in funding for your Waterbury complex and state hospital plans, and you're moving forward with those plans despite the uncertainty. In particular, you said you do want to break ground on a new state hospital before winter. So with the exact amount of money from FEMA still very much up in the air for what could be several years, what part of the plan can be funded now, and what are you willing to scrap, at least for the time being?
Let me first say that I'm incredibly proud of Vermonters vis-a-vis Irene. There's never been, I don't think, a better example in a major storm of how a state pulls together, comes together, helps each other out. And the fact that we've moved as far as we have in the year and a few weeks is truly a remarkable accomplishment. So I'm incredibly proud of Vermonters. I want to emphasize the crisis we're in and want to make very clear that this is no time for governors to be wishy-washy, to nibble around the edges, and to do studies and develop extensive red tape. Here's the challenge. We moved our most vulnerable mental health population out of our state hospital in the middle of the night or early morning. What that means is we right now have a mental health delivery system that is in crisis. Disaster could happen at any moment. Either patients could die or caregivers could be severely injured because we don't have adequate facilities. So the answer is we need to build the state hospital now, and we will. We're going to break ground in November. We're building beds in Brattleboro and Rutland, and we're building beds in Morrisville. In terms of the affordability, I believe we're going to get the resources we need from FEMA. They're frustrating. They're big government bureaucracy, but I believe we're going to get there. What we need now is leadership, not wishy-washy political words.
Okay, so if we are going to start with breaking ground on the state hospital complex first, are there portions, though, of the plan that we don't have the funding for? If we're looking for state funding, we will maybe not get to it right away or not know what the funding is for several years. So what are the parts of the plan that you outlined that you would be willing to delay or scrap until we know the funding?
Well, let's talk about the math. It's $45 million to build a new state hospital, build the beds in Brattleboro, build the beds in Rutland, build out Morrisville, to have a comprehensive community-based mental health system with a backup acute care system that will be state-of-the-art and second to none. The legislature put aside roughly $30 million anticipating this cost. So we've got $30 million of the 45 sitting there. We expect to get good results from FEMA when it comes to the state hospital. So we're going to be okay, I believe, and we must push ahead because we're in a crisis. Next question is, what about Waterbury? With Waterbury, it's a $125 million project to bring those jobs back to Waterbury, to build state-of-the-art, green, clean, fantastic office space for Vermont's future to really serve Vermont taxpayers. Now, what do? We believe FEMA is going to give us, again, the resources that we need. We also believe our insurance companies can give us about $15 to $20 million additional dollars. When you put the FEMA money together that we anticipate with the insurance money, we get close. How are we going to get to the rest of it? Through the bonding of the state of Vermont, through our capital bill. We are not going to exceed our bonding limits. We're going to maintain our, as I've been proud to do as governor, our bond rating. But I believe that in the end, we'll have the resources we need. What we don't have the luxury of doing is waiting for the federal bureaucracy to get their act together to tell us exactly what dollars we're going to get. I've made a lot of judgments during Irene. I think Vermonters have confidence in those judgments. I'm making another one. We're going to rebuild the state better than the way Irene found us. Part of that is a state-of-the-art mental health facility and a state-of-the-art office complex that will help rebuild downtown Waterbury. I'm committed to doing it.
Are you committed to building a heating plant in Waterbury? Are you committed to demolishing all of the buildings? Just very quickly.
We're going to go ahead with the plan that was outlined by the legislature, which is to demolish the old buildings, many of them, keep the historic buildings, and rebuild a state-of-the-art building. We have some flexibility if we get really bad news from FEMA to slightly downscale the new building to save $20 to $25 million. That's not ideal. That would be a backup plan. In terms of the heating plant, it's a $15 million cost to build the heating plant. We have outside contractors and companies who would be happy to build that for us and have us basically lease the heating, the juice from them and the heat from them. We're willing to look at that. Right there, you could easily save $40 or $45 million if you had to. We don't want to. I don't think we'll need to. But Randy's suggestion that we don't have a contingency plan is absolutely off the mark.
You're listening to VPR's Gubernatorial Debate. I'm Jane Lindholm with Bob Kinzel.
Let's talk about health care, because a lot of Vermonters care about this issue very much. Mr. Shumlin, you're a strong supporter of a single-payer system, a publicly financed system where all Vermonters are guaranteed of receiving coverage, and you'd like to put it in place as soon as possible. A lot of people would like to know, how are you going to finance this system? Right now, the average employer pays between 10 and 12% of their payroll to provide health care for their employees. Earlier this summer, you said that burden is much too high and that you would offset these costs by using other revenue sources. This is what you said.
My own view is that the current system that requires employers to pay 10 or 11 or 12% payroll to cover rising costs of health insurance is too high for business, who then are unable to invest in technology, in new hires, in research and development, and all the things that American and Vermont businesses should be doing to grow jobs for the future.
So based on this statement, it's clear you've been thinking about financing a single-payer plan. So tell us tonight, what tax would you raise? What new tax would you put into place to reduce the burdens on the state's business community?
Let me talk a little bit about where we need to go and what the challenge is, because it's important. Listen, first we have our hearts. In our hearts, in a state where we take care of each other, we know that we have 45,000 uninsured Vermonters and we have 160,000 underinsured Vermonters. 160,000 Vermonters who know that if they really get sick, they're not going to be able to pay the bill. They face financial disaster. That's our hearts. Now let's talk about our heads. Let's do Bill Clinton. Let's do the arithmetic for a minute. These are scary numbers. It's important to know the numbers because this is all about jobs and job growth in Vermont. Right now, under current rates of growth, if Vermont healthcare spending increases over the next 3 years, as it did over the last decade, we're going to be spending $2,500 a Vermonter on healthcare that we're not spending today. Or put it differently, we spend $5 billion right now on healthcare. By 2020, we'll be spending $10 billion. I ask an obvious question, where do we think that money's going to come from? So our single-payer healthcare effort is a very bold and courageous effort to reduce the rising cost of healthcare. The Green Mountain Healthcare Board is designing that cost containment system. We won't push send on how to pay for it unless they can get the cost containment delivery system right. That's the challenge. We're paying for it right now, $5 billion. We will be putting to the legislature in January all the options available to finance the plan. I can tell you that as a business person and as a governor, if we can be the first state that contains cost, removes health care from employment, and gets our spending under control, we'll grow the jobs, we'll grow the economic opportunities for Vermonters. I think we can get it done.
Realistically, you have just a few options available because of the money that you have to raise, particularly if you want to drop the business commitment from 12%, let's say, down to 6%. You've got the income tax. You've got the sales tax, perhaps an expansion of the sales tax, maybe a new tax on junk food. Tell us now, tonight, what are the options that you're looking at?
The options we all know are all the options you just outlined, plus premiums, which is what we use right now. In other words, if you said to me as a business person, let's just do some really simple math. Governor, you got a little business. I do. 18 employees. If you give us the money you're paying for health care right now, and your costs aren't going to go up for 5 years or 4 years, or you're going to arrest the rising cost, which is now 15, 20, 30%, businesses will say, hey, where can I sign up? The challenge is not how to pay for it. The challenge is how do we design a delivery system that moves from fee-for-service, where we reimburse providers for quantity, to outcomes-based medicine, quality. How do we use technology to reduce cost? That's the challenge. I think we can do it. We're making great progress. And I'll tell you this, when we get this right, I'm convinced that the other states will follow us in a more sensible, predictable healthcare system that's affordable. We right now in this country spend more on healthcare by 2 to 3 times than the developing countries that we compete with for jobs. We have pretty small shoes to fill, to find savings, to provide universal access, get this off the backs of business, and contain cost, reduce the rising cost of the unsustainable healthcare system. We've got to do that. We will do it. We'll put forward the options for paying for it in January. My guess, Bob, is that that decision won't be made by this legislature. It'll be made in the following biennium. That gives us the time to have a transparent and open and inclusive discussion about how Vermont best pays for health care.
Mr. Brock, late last week you released your vision for healthcare in Vermont. It's a vision that's very different than Mr. Shumlin's. You're a champion of the free market system, and you think increased competition in the private health insurance industry will help control costs. You compared healthcare to other consumer goods. You pointed out the cost of a flat-screen TV has gone down dramatically over the years as companies compete to sell this product. Some people think the car insurance industry serves as a good model for the healthcare industry. You know, if you get a bunch of speeding tickets or you're involved in a lot of accidents, your rates should go up. Last week I asked you if this was a good analogy, and this is what you said.
I do. I don't think that you can do that indefinitely, but I do think a movement in that direction that encourages more personal responsibility and personal ownership. I think that giving people stake in the game so that they actually look at the price tag and always have to pay some portion of it.
So unlike a speeding ticket, which is primarily my responsibility, I might have a medical condition that's not the result of my behavior in any way. So why is it fair to ask people who have these types of medical conditions to pay higher premiums for their health care?
A speeding ticket is something that you presumably have caused. And many times an illness is as a result of behavior over a period of time. People who don't take care of themselves, people who don't exercise, people who smoke, who drink to excess. Should there in fact be some reduction in insurance premium and insurance cost for people who practice wellness? And should we encourage wellness as part of a healthcare plan and program? And I think we should. Clearly there are limits, and clearly what I want in my plan is to ensure that there is in fact affordable health care for every Vermonter. And the ability to access that care. And my plan does that. And my plan focuses, though, on the discrete elements of cost. It focuses on solving the cost problem and also using the free market to do it. And we have to recognize that for 50 years, we haven't had a free market. We say that healthcare is different, that it doesn't behave in the same way that other market products do. But every other aspect of healthcare that is not regulated by government, to the extent that it is, with the degree of mandates that we have, also behaves like the free market.
Mr. Shumlin says that health care is a right of all Vermonters and not a privilege. Do you agree with that concept? And how does your answer influence your vision to achieve universal access to health care in Vermont?
I believe that health care is a responsibility. You know, as we go back and we look at rights as defined in our Constitution from the Founding Fathers forward, rights were often things that we had that enabled us to be protected against government. They were not necessarily rights that were defined as entitlements, and that's what this does. It, in effect, creates a right that someone else typically has to pay for your health care. I believe that that is a responsibility of every individual, and that's of every individual who is able to. For those individuals who are not able to, my plan provides a safety net. It provides a mechanism to ensure that for those for whom there is not affordable health care, for those who are the sick, the disabled, the elderly, that there is in fact a safety net and a means to cover those people and provide them with the assistance that they need.
You're listening to VPR's Gubernatorial Debate. I'm Jane Lindholm with Bob Kinzel. Peter Shumlin, you ran on a platform of education from K to 16, actually even earlier, pre-K, universal pre-K. So what can you point to as specific achievements in the last 2 years that show that you've improved access, financial sustainability, or student outcomes since you took office?
Let me first say that my focus for the last 2 years has been jobs and job growth. We've made some big gains there. As you know, we now have the 5th lowest unemployment rate in America. That's a huge achievement. We have faster growth than our neighboring New England states. We all know that that's tied to education. When I go out and talk to employers, when I was first elected, folks, business leaders would say to me, Governor, I'm thinking about doing a layoff. They kind of look at their boots. Now they turn to me and they say, Governor, I can't find enough employees to do the work, who are trained to do the work that we have available. That's a better problem to have, but we all know it's government's obligation to have the best education system to deal with that challenge. So that's what we're doing. We're building that system. This is what we're doing. As soon as I got elected, I lifted the ban on pre-K, the cap on pre-K, so that now every student in Vermont has a strong start. They can get early childhood education, which we know every dollar we spend on early education results in saving $7 later on. Huge, important investment. Second,
but there are no state stats on that yet that show how many more children are in pre-K that
no,
I can find.
That's true, but anecdotally I can tell you, if you read the press, you'll see that suddenly school districts this fall are going, wow, we got to double our pre-K because we got so many kids piling the doors. Trust me, the kids are going. Second, I'm the first governor to actually get the commissioner of education elevated to a secretary and be appointed by the governor. That's incredibly important. That evaded Governor Snelling, Governor Kunin, Governor Dean, Governor Douglas. We're getting tough things done. We've done it. What that means is that the governor in January, I or whoever is governor, will have the privilege of appointing a secretary of education to set the policy for the state of Vermont.
And how will that actually improve test scores or improve access to education to have a cabinet-level secretary?
Let me give you a concrete example. We saw recently that our test scores in math and science are pretty bad in Vermont compared to our other test scores. I called up the commissioner. I said, Commissioner, why are we having this challenge? He said, well, because in Vermont right now, only 47% of kids are required to take algebra in 9th grade and 32% required to take geometry in 10th grade, and that's what the test is based on. So I said, wow, that doesn't make much sense for us to compete in a global economy and in a U.S. economy where science, math, technology, and science are so important. Let's get this fixed. He agreed with me. We go to the state board and we say, it's really important, we believe, that we require algebra in 9th grade, geometry in 10th grade in our public school systems. And the state board said, well, we'll think about it, we're not so sure. That is not a system of direction for education. I think the governor should have the power to implement policy that will make a difference. That's a concrete example, a concrete change that I will change in the next 2 years if I have the privilege of being reelected governor of the state of Vermont. That'll help grow jobs. Finally, both workforce retraining and higher education, Vermont Tech, kids who aren't going to go to a 4-year degree. We've been funding and working together with UVM and others to really build the best higher education system in the country. So that's what we're doing.
Randy Brock, you state in your platform that you will, quote, challenge the educational establishment that permits costs to increase every year while student enrollment falls and test scores stagnate at unimpressive levels. But the most recent analysis of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is sometimes called the nation's report card, shows Vermont near the top in tests of reading and math across all of the tested levels. So I'll ask you about funding second, but what is it exactly that you want to fix in our test scores?
Let me just ask, what is the time limit for questions? I've noticed that we've had some rather lengthy answers.
We have had lengthy answers. We're working on a minute, but we're trying to give both of you equal time and equal follow-ups.
All right. The cost per pupil for education has gone up 149.9% in the past 10 years, while our enrollment has declined by 18.3%. It doesn't take a genius to realize that that is an absolutely unsustainable situation that we need to correct. Now, I was on the Senate Education Committee 3 years ago, and I looked at the 15 highest spending districts of the state and the 15 lowest spending districts of the state. Interestingly enough, there was no statistically significant difference between the test scores in each. We hired a consultant who did a look at our education funding system in the past year and found similar things, that the amount of money that we're spending doesn't necessarily correlate to educational outcomes. So one of the things that I certainly want to do is challenge the educational establishment, and I, like the governor, support further accountability in education overall. I was a supporter of, and indeed supported in the last biennium before this one, the appointment of an education so that we could have true accountability and that we would take a dysfunctional system and make it in fact functional. So I believe that that is one step in that direction.
That didn't quite answer my question, which is what exactly about the test scores would you like to see improved?
I would like to see the total test scores improved because even though they are improving, if you calculate how long it would take for us to reach competency or as defined in these particular standards, it's a matter of decades, and that is not an acceptable rate of progress.
What level of local control are you willing to sacrifice in order to achieve the broader statewide goals and cost containment that you'd like to see?
I think it's important to maintain local control because local involvement does, in many cases, improve local schools. Now, to that end, I sponsored a portion of it, the education bill that passed 2 years ago called virtual mergers. The education department has not placed a great deal of emphasis on that, but I think that that is a very important way to achieve both ends, to be able to provide educational management oversight standards on a much broader basis and still maintain a semblance of local control by allowing school districts to contract with each other, supervisory units to operate curricula and other kinds of activities on a larger basis, but without having to collapse the school district structure. That's one way to bring educational enrichment programs across district lines. It's another way to allow teachers more opportunity to expand what they do over a wider area, and it's a better way to get kids more involved because you're able to give them more subject matter and more instruction.
Let's turn to energy. Mr. Brock, you're a proponent of nuclear power, but you have serious problems with the operations of Vermont Yankee. You told the Newport Daily Express this summer that you'd like to see a new nuclear power plant built in Vermont, one with the latest technology to recycle the radioactive waste generated at that facility. So would you tell us tonight, where are you going to build this plant? What's a good location? And how are you going to convince folks in towns that live nearby that this is actually a good idea?
Well, one of the places to build it, and I put a bill in to explore, and let's underline the word explore, the possibility of doing that on the current site in Vernon that does appear to have sufficient space to do that. And I was talking at that time about at least let's examine the possibility of a new state-of-the-art plant of the same type that's in wide use in France, for example, and that does reprocess spent nuclear fuel rather than store it on a riverbank. This is the same type of plant that President Obama has, in his energy policies, been suggesting for some period of time. The issue of local community control and local community involvement certainly is going to be one of those hurdles that you would have to encounter, and we would do that in much the same way that we would cite any other facility. Hopefully it wouldn't take as long as it did to build a Walmart in St. Albans.
Also, while we're talking about energy, let's focus on wind for a second. There's been a lot of controversy over the siting of wind turbines in Lowell. There's concern over other wind projects in other parts of the state. Would you support a statewide moratorium of all wind projects until a comprehensive evaluation has been done to establish specific guidelines for all future projects?
I supported and proposed an amendment in the last session to place a 2-year moratorium on wind. Industrial wind, though, and it's a particular kind of wind, and that's the kind of wind that uses 400-foot towers that blasts off the tops of our scenic ridge lines in order to site wind towers that creates almost interstate-wide lanes up the sides of our mountains to do that. And I believe that we do need to do more study and we need to do more impact. I think we also need to look at the regulatory environment that allows this to happen, to take it more broadly from the town in which the project is sited because of its significant effect on the surrounding communities. We see throughout Vermont an increasing concern of people. We see it in Lowell, we see it in Sheffield, we see it in Derby, we see it in Newark, we see it at Grandpa's Knob. And people in Vermont so often are feeling that folks aren't listening to them. The governor, for example, in a An interview with the Newport Daily News said, well, of course we wouldn't cite these things on Mount Mansfield or Camel's Hump or our other cherished natural treasures. But the message that sends is that the rest of our ridgelines are not scenic and the people who live there are not important. And I think that's a mistake.
Mr. Shumlin, you've been a strong opponent of the Vermont Yankee plant. You'd like to shut it down tomorrow if you could.
Yesterday.
You were president of the Senate when a vote was taken on the relicensing of Vermont Yankee for another 20 years, and by a vote of 26-4, the Senate said no. However, a federal court found the legislature overstepped its boundaries with the passage of this law. So here's the situation we have while the case is under appeal, which could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. 1, Vermont Yankee is still operating. 2, none of the power produced at the plant is being sold to Vermont utilities. 3, more radioactive waste is being generated, waste that will have to be stored on site. Some people think your strategy has been a total failure. You've achieved none of your goals, and you've cost the state millions of dollars in legal fees, with more cost to come. Why are they wrong?
Listen, I'm incredibly disappointed with the court decision on Vermont Yankee, but I believe this, that in the end, justice will prevail, and Vermont will have the right, be given the right by the court, to hold Vermont Yankee to their promise, which was to build a plant, run it till 2012, and shut it down in March of 2012. I think the decision by Judge Murtha was a disappointment. I think we have a chance of prevailing in the higher court. Second, the Public Service Board, and that's a process I have tremendous confidence in, has to issue a certificate of public good for them to continue to operate. I have confidence in that system. So for us to suggest that this is going to be an easy ride, we knew it wouldn't be. But I do believe in the end that we will succeed in shutting down that aging, leaking plant. I want to say a word about Randy's proposal of a new plant at that site. Listen, the math doesn't work. Even if it were a good idea, which I don't believe it is, it takes 5 years to cool down a nuclear power plant. It would take 10 years to take the carcass of that plant away if Entergy Louisiana had funded a decommissioning fund, which they haven't. So under the best scenario, it would take 15 years to prepare your site for this quote-unquote new plant. A new plant hasn't been built in Vermont, in America, in almost 35 years. I do not believe that we will ever see a new nuclear plant in Vermont. So let's focus on the prize, building renewables, getting off our addiction to oil, ensuring that we have a small community-generated energy base of renewable power.
Let me ask you the same question about wind that I posed to Mr. Brock. Would you support a statewide moratorium on all future wind projects?
Let me put this question in context. I've been governor for almost 2 years, and I've now managed 4 major climate change storms. The biggest blizzard ever recorded a year ago, February. The floods of April. The floods of May. August's Irene. Extraordinary devastation. 12 inches of rain dumped on Vermont in 6 hours. We didn't used to get storms like that. Climate change is here. It's alive and well. My view about energy policy is as follows. The special interests, the politicians, don't want to talk about climate change. They don't want to talk about our need to get off of our addiction to oil and coal and move to renewables. I believe it is prudent for Vermont to move to renewables as quickly as we know how, and that means all of the renewables, wind, solar, biomass, small hydro, you name it, we should be looking at it. Now, in terms of wind, the answer is no on a moratorium, but this is my policy on wind. I'm a big believer in local control. If a community who hosts a wind project votes against it, as I believe they will at Grandpa's Knob, I will be against it, and I'll instruct, and I have instructed my public service commissioner to go down to the Public Service Board and say we shouldn't build it. If a community votes to host it, and it makes sense in terms of the rest of the criteria, I support it. So I trust the board. I will join Vermonters in maintaining local control. Communities matter to me. If they say no, I say no. If they say yes, I say let's go.
This is VPR's debate with the major party candidates for governor, Democrat Peter Shumlin and his Republican challenger, Randy Brock. Coming up next, the candidates will have a chance to directly question one another, and then later in the debate, we'll hear from listeners on the issues of most importance to them. This is VPR.
Hi, it's Lynn Rossetto Casper, host of The Splendid Table, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you at the VPR Listener Picnic. Join me for an afternoon of live music and awesome Vermont food, and we're going to play Stump the Cook. The VPR Listener Picnic is Saturday, the 29th of September from 11 to 3 at the Vermont Agricultural Business Education Center in Brattleboro. Find all the details at vpr.net.
This is listener-supported Vermont Public Radio. We have additional funding today from the Green Life Main Street Burlington, featuring organic mattresses and bedding for babies through adults, thegreenlifevt.com. And VITA, offering alternative loan programs for business financing to help stimulate investment in Vermont's economy, online at veda.org.
Welcome back to VPR's Governor's Debate between Republican Randy Brock and Democrat Peter Shumlin. I'm Bob Kinzel with Jane Lindholm.
In this round, the candidates have an opportunity to ask each other questions. Just a reminder, the questions should not exceed 30 seconds. We're not looking for speeches here. They should be questions, and answers are limited to 60 seconds. Follow-up questions are encouraged, but again, they need to be on subject.
Randy Brock, start us off. What's your first question for Peter Shumlin?
Well, this is a follow-up to the discussion that we had a few moments ago about industrial wind. And Governor, why do you believe it is appropriate and it makes sense to create a renewable portfolio standard that would, according to the Public Service Board, cost Vermont ratepayers from $300 to $435 million over the next 20 years, and according to your Public Service Department, would result in the reduction of carbon emissions of less than 3% in a state that has 0.2% of the nation's population? Why do you believe that it is appropriate to do that and place those huge costs on the backs of poor and working Vermonters for a period of 20 to 25 years while rewarding a small group of renewable energy entrepreneurs with tax credits and tax subsidies right now?
Well, I don't, and that's why I made sure it didn't become law in this legislative session. So I appreciate your joining me in helping make that happen. I do believe that we're better off using incentives like standard offer to promote renewable energy in Vermont. And we're succeeding. You know, we're growing jobs, we're growing economic opportunities. That's what this is about. Right now, Vermont has more green high-tech jobs per capita than any other state in the country. That's happened over the last couple of years. That's a big development. So I believe as we grow renewables, as we show the rest of the country how to do energy right, programs like Standard Offer are more successful than one that you just outlined, which we didn't adopt. Our challenge in Vermont is to find the balance between growing renewables and affordable electric rates, because affordable electric rates result in jobs. That's why I supported the merger between CVPS and GMP. It's going to reduce electric rates for Vermonters by $140 million in the first 10 years, $500 million in the next 20 years, simply because we're getting rid of big bureaucrat salaries and consolidating the operation. So I don't support what you just outlined. I instead support the bill I signed into law.
May I follow up on that then with a question about the green jobs? Do you know, Governor, what the second state behind Vermont in the most green jobs is, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics?
I don't.
It's the District of Columbia. And the reason is because environmental lawyers are considered green jobs. And we have a lot of those in Vermont. VPRG employees are considered green jobs. School bus drivers are considered green jobs.
As long as
and one of the things that we find ourselves seeing so often in Vermont is junk statistics. And that green job statistic, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics underlying data, is what I would define as a junk statistic. I would add, have you been up to Lowell and taken a look at the license plates in the parking lot, building those wind towers? And isn't it correct that virtually all of those plates belong to people from states other than Vermont?
So are you telling me that you want to fire the folks in Vermont who have green jobs, lay them off?
No, what I'm saying is that it is a meaningless statistic. And when we look at the construction of those wind towers, it's largely not being done by Vermonters.
I have been up in Lowell. I obviously encourage companies who contract with Vermont to hire Vermonters, and we've done a lot in my administration to make sure that happens. But I just want to back up to the basic premise here. I'm pretty proud of the green jobs we've created in this state, and it isn't all environmental lawyers. We're building the best solar trackers in the world, I believe. That's one of the fastest growing companies in America right here in Chittenden County. Northern Power Systems, growing the smartest small windmills, I believe, powering all over the world, best windmills, best design. Instead of using gears, as you know, they're using magnets. So it solves all kinds of maintenance problems. Up and down the state, we have both large and small, innovative entrepreneurs and businesses that's helping us to lead to the jobs recovery that's going on in Vermont. We're beating the other New England states. We're making great progress. I'm kind of surprised that you're suggesting that you want to get rid of green jobs, Randy.
Let's move on to our next round. You can come back to that in another round if you'd like to. Mr. Shumlin, your question for Mr. Brock.
I enjoyed serving in the Senate with you, and one of the votes that I remember well in your articulate speech was around the question of whether or not to continue operation of Vermont Yankee. And what you said in that speech, I'll never forget, was, I shouldn't paraphrase, but I'll try. You said, if the anti-nuclear activists had infiltrated Entergy's board of directors, they couldn't have done as good a job of convincing us that Entergy Louisiana shouldn't do business in the state of Vermont. You then joined the majority of the Senate in voting no for continued operation of Vermont Yankee. Would you make the same vote today?
I voted in that way, and I went on to articulate the particular reasons why. And the particular reasons were twofold. I said to myself, would I enter into a contract for 20 years with someone I didn't trust? And I don't trust Entergy Louisiana, and so I answered that question no. The second was that at the time, Entergy said to us it was non-negotiable in terms of going on with that contract, that they were going to spin that off, that subsidiary, that Vermont Yankee and the other elderly plants, into a subsidiary and take $3.5 billion out, put it in the pockets of Entergy shareholders. I saw no business reason for that. And then it would leave a plant that would have to go to the bond market and borrow $1.5 billion more. That was a bad deal for Vermont, and that's why I voted the way I did. But I held open the door that if there was control or management by someone other than Entergy in terms of operating that plant, and as you know, the Annexus deal, the spinoff, went away. That opens the door up again. And we hadn't had the results of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's decision that now tell us, A, it's not our business to determine safety, and B, the plant is safe. So I would review that decision.
I agree with your observation that Entergy Louisiana can't be trusted and that we shouldn't be doing business with them. And I think that's a very prudent observation. I guess my next question follow-up is, would you then, as governor, buy power from Entergy Louisiana's leaking, unreliable, untrustworthy management?
At this point, since we are buying our power, and we are buying nuclear power today, make no mistake, we're buying nuclear power from Seabrook in New Hampshire, and we're buying it for 2 cents a kilowatt hour less than the best offer that we had from Entergy. So Entergy would have to offer us a heck of a lot better deal for me to consider it.
We're going to switch up the order here. Peter Shumlin, your question again for Randy Brock. Next question.
Thank you. Another vote that took place when we were in the Senate together was on marriage equality. And as you know, I sponsored the marriage equality bill. It was the first marriage equality bill to pass in America, not because the judges ordered us to do it, but because we felt it was the right thing to do. I'm very proud of that vote. You were among a small minority of people that voted no on marriage equality. You didn't think those rights should be granted. I'm curious, as the thinking has evolved nationally on this subject, and now the first president of the United States has stated that he supports marriage equality, would you vote the same today as you did then?
I voted contrary. I voted against the bill to provide for same-sex marriage because I believe that the redefinition of marriage from that of one man and one woman, which has existed for centuries as a tradition in not just America but the world in general, was the proper thing to do. Let me emphasize, though, it was not a vote against people who are different than the traditional heterosexual couple. Indeed, I said, and I said on the floor of the Senate, that I support ensuring that we have equal rights for all. And I supported the background of the decision of the Vermont Supreme Court that led us to the civil union law in the first place. Now, the key to remember is that's past. It's over. Vermont has made its decision. It's time to move on. I've certainly moved on, and indeed, as a justice of the peace, I was proud several months ago to perform my first marriage of a same-sex couple, longtime friends, supporters, and contributors. If elected governor, I'm not going to roll back the clock. I would not support any legislation that would do so. Same-sex marriage is a reality. It's time to move on.
But my question is very simply, if you could vote on the right side of history on that question today, would you vote yes for marriage equality or no?
Since we are where we are today and it is a reality in Vermont, I would vote yes.
Thank you.
Randy Brock, your question.
Do you think, Governor, it was appropriate for the governor of the state that has the highest per capita teenage use of marijuana to actively solicit campaign contributions in return for a role as a national spokesman for an organization that advocates the legalization of marijuana, a drug that's resulted in a high rate of crime and criminal activity on the southern borders of the United States?
Let me first say, Randy, that I don't accept campaign contributions in return for anything. And I don't believe there's a Vermont public official who accepts campaign contributions in return for anything. This is not Chicago. Period. So to answer your question, no, I would never make a campaign contribution request, and I know you're trying to make many of them, and I'm trying to make many of them, in return for anything. I ask people who support me to support me. In terms of this question, I firmly believe that Vermont should decriminalize marijuana. When I look at the challenge we have with addiction, with OxyContin, with FDA-approved drugs, and see the rising cost of drug use in Vermont, the crime, the pain, and the suffering as a result of it, I firmly believe we should use our law enforcement resources and dollars to decriminalize marijuana, and I stand by that decision.
Well, Governor, just to be clear, did you or did you not, in the same telephone call, indicate that you wanted to be a national spokesman for NORML, the marijuana legalization organization, and in the same phone call solicit a campaign contribution?
No, what I reported on was a conversation actually that I'd had with the Soros Foundation to find ways to articulate on a national level my belief that we are misguided in our policy on marijuana in Vermont and in America. And I said that I would be willing to go anywhere, anytime that I can get there, to fight for what I believe is right, which is cracking down on drugs that are killing people, that are leading to crime and addiction, and decriminalizing and stopping the crazy resources misallocation that we're currently doing to fight small amounts of marijuana. I don't suggest that Vermont kids should be smoking marijuana. I don't think they should be drinking alcohol. My point is we are losing the drug battle right now in Vermont. We have rising addiction to FDA-approved OxyContin and other drugs. I want to see us spend our resources on that. I've made some very specific proposals to the legislature that I think would give us the tools to help us fight that war. But right now, including bath salts, which you know I've been very proactive on, but I really do believe that I can be a voice and should be a voice for a more sane drug policy in Vermont and in America, and I'm willing to do it anytime.
This is VPR's debate between the major party candidates for governor, Republican Randy Brock and Democrat Peter Shumlin.
And in this segment, the candidates are questioning each other on key issues in this race. Mr. Shumlin, your next question for Mr. Brock.
Randy, early on in your campaign, you invited Governor LePage from Maine down here, and you stood next to him while he reiterated his feeling that the IRS is equivalent to the Gestapo. Comparing the IRS to folks that killed millions and millions of innocent people, I thought was outrageous. You stood by and said nothing. Do you regret not speaking up at the time and uninviting and making clear that this was not appropriate for Vermont to make these outrageous statements here in the Green Mountain State, where we obviously view tolerance at a very high level?
Governor LePage has never been noted for political correctness, and he did not disappoint this time. I certainly said to the media that I didn't agree with that statement, and I don't. At the same time, though, it's clear that the governor was using hyperbole. He was using hyperbole in the same way that a show like Seinfeld refers to the soup Nazi. He was not referring to the IRS in the same way that we believe the Gestapo performed during World War II. He was using it as an example to get attention. He got attention.
So you're defending his remarks?
I said I didn't agree with his remarks. They were not my remarks, and I thought they were unfortunate. That's what I said.
but I just heard you say, but he didn't really mean it.
What I said was he was using it as hyperbole, and that was very clear.
So, Mr. Brock, your next question for Mr. Shumlin.
The Tax Foundation has indicated that Vermont is first in the nation in its tax burden, as has a national magazine, financial magazine, within the last several days. Forbes magazine puts Vermont as 45th in the nation in terms of business friendliness. We see Vermont as dead last in the nation, 50th in the nation, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in the gross domestic product produced per person. What do you say to a young person considering coming to or staying in Vermont with a business climate like that?
Well, let me first say that I'd say to them, stick with Vermont and stick with the governor you have, because I have now balanced 2 consecutive budgets the old-fashioned way by matching Montpelier's appetite for spending with Vermonters' ability to pay without raising broad-based taxes, and I'm proud of that. I think in a tough recession, when Vermonters are having trouble paying their bills, they can't afford to pay more taxes. I keep saying, I can do tax policy because I'm the first governor in 50 years that can see New Hampshire from my house, and it doesn't look like Russia. So I think we've done well in holding the line on broad-based taxes. Second, I'm very suspicious of those national surveys generally, what they include, what they don't include, how they compare us. Having said that, I'm really glad and proud of the fact that I'm a Vermont business person who built 2 businesses here and understands that there is no better place in America to do business. Best workforce, best quality of life, best schools, best place to get it done. And I think that's why we're seeing the job growth we are. CNN recently listed Vermont as the 8th most entrepreneurial state. We're getting real economic growth. We're beating our New England neighbors, including the state of New Hampshire. And, I'm just not a doom and gloom kind of governor, Randy. I do believe that by the smart policies that we've implemented, holding a line on spending, cutting instead of raising broad-based taxes, and encouraging businesses to grow in Vermont, we're going to continue to see a more prosperous future for our kids and our grandkids.
Governor, you said cutting broad-based taxes. What broad-based tax did you cut?
Well, I believe that I misspoke. I said not raising broad-based taxes at a tough time. Obviously, we're in a recession. We can't cut taxes. I would like to cut taxes if we had a surplus.
We do have time for a 4th round of questions. Randy Brock, your question for Peter Shumlin.
A national figure talking about health care has said, my guiding principle is and always has been that consumers do better where there is choice and competition. And that was President Obama speaking in September of 2009 in an address to Congress on health care policy. Is he right or wrong?
One thing I really admire about the president is he understands, and I told all 50 governors when I was president a year ago, January, that he believes the states will be the laboratory for real health care reform. He's been very open about the fact that he doesn't think the Affordable Care Act got us all the way. With all the lobbyists and special interests in Washington that killed real reform down there, you can bet that they're going to be lining up here in Vermont to try kill real reform here. What I can tell you about the president's view on health care is he's excited about what we're trying to do in Vermont. He wants to give the states the latitude to be the laboratories for change, to take the Affordable Care Act, which is a great first step, and build on that. Now listen, I believe as governor that the most important thing Vermont can do to grow jobs and economic opportunities is to get healthcare spending under control. I've got a bold and impressive plan to get that done. Your plan raises rates on seniors, raises rates on vulnerable, sick people, people who have pre-existing conditions. Republican Governor Dick Snelling, a moderate Republican, took past community rating to protect those folks, to fix a broken system 21 years ago, and you want to go back, take it back, because you believe that free market will solve all our problems. I just think you're dead wrong. If that were true, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in.
Well, first, let me correct, Governor, based on what the Snelling family has said and has indicated today, that that's not what Dick Snelling did. And what Dick Snelling did is formed a Blue Ribbon Commission headed by former Senator Art Gibb to study that and other issues related to health care, but the bill that dealt with community rating was passed on a day before that commission actually started work. That's one, just as an aside.
He signed it into law.
He signed it into law as governors sign many things into law that contain many things with which they do not necessarily agree or have not necessarily studied in detail. But to say that he's the architect of it is factually incorrect.
Well, I knew Governor Snelling fairly well, and I can tell you, I never saw him sign a bill that he didn't believe in. He was not a meek man. He was a great man.
Well, that's absolutely correct. But as you know, as governor, you've signed many bills that contain many pages, that contain many provisions, one of which you may not necessarily agree to, but you've signed the bill.
The community rating was the heart of that bill. If the governor hadn't agreed with it, I can assure you he'd have vetoed it.
Moving on, Peter Shumlin, your question for Randy Brock.
Randy, as we look at the business climate in Vermont, I'm very optimistic about the future. As I mentioned, we have grown jobs. We have added, I don't think I have mentioned this, but we've added 7,500 jobs since I came into office 2 years ago. As I mentioned, we have the fifth lowest unemployment rate in America. I think that by departing from the doom and gloom, spreading all across the world, that, as you just stated, you claim that all these publications suggest that Vermont's a good place to do not a good place to do business. I think we've done a great service to Vermont in the last 2 years by touting the fact that we are a great place to do business. Are you going to take us back to a policy where you broadcast to the world how terrible things are? I've never sold anything by telling folks how bad my product is.
I've always sold things by telling people the truth, and that by making a better product. And that's what I think we should do in Vermont. I think we should make a better product. And my plan for the economy is to start out by going to every border of Vermont and tacking up a sign that says Vermont is open for business, because the perception is that Vermont is not open for business. You ask Vermonters what the problems are and why our economy is as fragile as it is, and they will tell you overwhelmingly that one of the reasons is we have a government that is overregulated, a government that has heavy burdens of regulation, and it's a government in which we need to be able to do things simpler and easier and faster and more transparently without as much red tape while still protecting our core environmental areas. But it's also a situation in which I know we have this 5% rate that keeps being touted. But every time I go in front of an audience of 15 or 20 or 30 people, I ask them, are you unemployed? Do you have a friend or neighbor who's unemployed? Raise your hands. Secondly, do you have a child who's graduated from high school or graduated from college and has left Vermont before even entering the workforce? In every audience, all over Vermont, regardless of the economic level of the people in the audience, 60 to 70% of the hands go up. That's a lot more, Governor, than 5%.
My simple question then as a follow-up, Randy, is if you believe that's true, if it's all doom and gloom, why did we add 7,500 jobs in the last 2 years? Why do we have the fifth lowest unemployment in America rate? Why are we growing faster than our New England states? Why are we seeing that housing sales are up by double digits this year and car sales are up by 8.7% over last year? Why, when I talk to business folks, are they saying, Governor, we're doing okay, things are picking up, we have more work to do, but we're doing better? Why would you preach doom and gloom when the evidence suggests just the opposite?
Well, the evidence does suggest that, again, but you have to delve into statistics. And it's just as I mentioned before, you can have numbers, but then you can have real statistics that you understand. If you take a look at the average total employment growth in Vermont between 2007 and 2011, we're 28th in the nation. But then when you strip out government and nonprofit jobs, we drop to 44th. We're growing some jobs. We're not growing the right jobs. We need to focus on growing the right jobs.
This is VPR's debate between the major party candidates for governor, Democrat Peter Shumlin and Republican Randy Brock. Coming up next, we'll hear the candidates answer questions posed by our listeners. This is VPR.
Thanks for joining us. This is listener-supported Vermont Public Radio, WVPA St. Johnsbury at 88.5, WVPR Windsor at 89.5, WVPS Burlington at 107.9, WRVT Rutland at 88.7, WBTN Bennington at 94.3, in Manchester at 106.9, and at vpr.net. Support for VPR comes from our contributing listeners and Year of the Arts at Dartmouth, celebrating the vibrancy of the arts through programs all year at arts.dartmouth.edu. And Snowflake, a Vermont-inspired spa offering gift certificates, solarium, fitness centers, treatment rooms, salon, and private sanctuary lounges, snowflake.com. VPR.com. You're listening to the gubernatorial debate on Vermont Public Radio.
Welcome back to VPR's Governor's Debate between Republican Randy Brock and Democrat Peter Shumlin. I'm Jane Lindholm with Bob Kinzel in the VPR Performance Studio.
We've been encouraging our listeners to write and record questions for the candidates, and we turn this round of questioning over to them.
Many questions were submitted on the topic of the F-35 fighter jet that may be based with the Vermont National Guard at the Burlington Airport. A lot of people wrote about their concern that the noise will impact the quality of life in surrounding towns. George in Winooski asks, do you support bringing the F-35 to Vermont? If yes, how do you plan to compensate those who will be financially impacted in a negative way, especially homeowners who might lose substantial value in their property? Randy Brock, first to you.
Well, one question is whether or not that loss of value is in fact a real concern. I've taken a look at some of the Air Force studies, and I actually talked to an aeronautical scientist about the F-35, and the information that I have is that although the F-35 is noisier at full volume, at high speed, it actually is less noisy at takeoff speed than the F-16, so I'm told. I think we need to look at the science of this a lot more carefully before we rush to conclusions about potential harm. And I'm not sure that we've done that as thoroughly as we should. So I think we need to look at that issue more carefully. But preliminarily, I don't see that as being the major problem that some do.
And you support
I
bringing
support
the
the F-35. The economic importance of the F-35 to the Burlington area and to Vermont, I don't think can be underestimated. There are lots of jobs, lots of economic activity, and a great part of our economy in the Burlington area depends on this.
Peter Shumlin, same question to you.
I agree with Randy. It's interesting. I spoke with someone recently who stood at the air base and listened to the F-35 without the afterburner. And
F-16?
F-35.
So not the air base in Vermont?
Not in Vermont, no. Florida. F-35 without, and this is someone I trust, without the afterburner, and the F-16 with the afterburner, and they thought the F-16 with the afterburner was louder. So that's important information. I think we will find that if you don't use the afterburner, which you won't, the F-35 will not make more noise than the F-16. That's the first point. The second point that has not been widely broadcast is we're talking about 6 minutes a day, 4 days a week. That's really important. That's been lost. Somehow I think we have this image that we're going to be hearing these F-35s overhead all the time. It is 6 minutes a day, 4 days a week. I personally believe that in terms of property values, Winooski and the rest, the biggest obstacle to values of property from the airport are from the constant flights of commercial jets, FedEx, UPS, than they are from the military. We've got to bring the F-35 to Burlington. It's going to grow jobs, economic opportunities, and I think that the noise issue will not be what it has been presented as.
Some of our listeners recorded questions for the candidates tonight, including Lisa in Woodstock.
What are the candidates' ideas for improving affordable housing for young people in Vermont? This group is making an exodus from our state, and it would be nice to attract them back to Vermont.
Mr. Shumlin.
It's a top priority of our administration. We've been working very hard, first of all, for the first time in years, to fully fund the Housing and Conservation Fund, trust fund, so that we ensure that we're actually putting the resources into our downtowns, into our communities, to help support low-income housing for young people as well as for seniors and other vulnerable Vermonters. We're making some real progress there. I think Vermont probably has the best example of how to do land preservation and low-income housing of any state in the country. So I can't tell you how supportive I am, even in tough economic times with a tough budget where I had to make many cuts. I insisted as governor that we fully fund that program. So that's one thing we're doing. The second thing we're trying to do is to find ways to make capital more available to first-time home buyers. And I think between those two efforts, we're going to make some real progress. Now, the third thing I just want to mention very briefly is I believe when we create jobs, we get young people to stay in Vermont. They haven't been leaving Vermont because they don't want to be here. They leave Vermont because they can't get a good job. And I think that the fact that we're growing jobs is going to result in more young people staying right here in the state of Vermont.
Mr. Brock, your thoughts?
I agree with the governor regarding the availability of capital and to do what we can, along with the private sector, our partners in the private sector, to ensure that there is wider availability of capital. At the same time, though, I believe that housing is a province largely of the private sector, and one of the best things that we can do is encourage the private sector to produce housing that people can afford. And there are two ways to do that. The first way is to take a good hard look at our regulatory environment and the cost of regulation, the cost of permitting, the cost of our entire labyrinth of regulatory provisions to ensure that those are simplified, made more transparent, made faster, made easier to operate, and made less costly through regulatory reform. And in so doing, we will reduce the cost of housing proportionally. I think the second thing is jobs. The more jobs that we have, the more vibrant a private sector we have, the more people will be able to afford the housing that they want, the more demand will be created. And there are a variety of ways which in the length of time I have to answer, I can't go into the detail that I would like to accomplish that. But my focus is on green jobs as well as the governor's, except my definition of green jobs includes the kind of green stuff that you fold up and you put in your pocket. And I want to put more of that in the pocket of every Vermonter.
We have a question from Andre, who writes, can you please explain why Vermont's cell phone service continues to be poor in many locations, why it does not match the quality of service in neighboring states? Randy Brock.
It's because we haven't devoted the money to the infrastructure necessary to expand cellular service statewide. I'm pleased with the fact that we've got some $200 million plus from the federal government for the first time as part of the federal stimulus money, and that the legislature passed, and I supported the bill that I know the governor's administration is implementing right now to extend broadband and cellular service statewide. I think we need to continue to do more work on that and devote more money to it. I think that broadband is first, and I think it will make a tremendous difference in making Vermont, everywhere in Vermont, every corner of Vermont, a place in which Vermonters can do business that they can't right now.
Janie, answer to your question is geography. We have lots of hills and lots of valleys, and it's one of the toughest places in the world to get universal cell service. This is what we're doing. As my job's plan, as you know, in addition to balancing the budgets without raising broad-based taxes, we have 4 major points. Healthcare, which we've talked about, education, which we've talked about, energy, which we've talked about, and Connect Vermont. I made the promise when I took office that I would connect Vermont to high-speed internet access every last mile by the end of 2013, and we're going to deliver on that promise. That won't mean universal cell service, but it will mean improved cell service, because we're driving fiber as deep and far as we can, and then we're going to make the rest of the last mile with a wireless infrastructure. That wireless infrastructure will also improve cell service. So universal high-speed internet to come if you stick with this team, better cell service, but not universal.
We touched on wind energy earlier, but Connie asked this related question. She writes, I live in Albany at the 2-mile mark from the Lowell wind towers. I am likely more impacted by Lowell's Ridgeline development than many Lowell residents. How is it democratic not to give residents of neighboring towns a voice and a vote in this process? Earlier, Governor, you said towns should have veto power over it. What about the neighboring towns?
You know, it's a tough question, and I'm sympathetic to discussions about how we improve the system for siting all renewable energy. But let's just remember, there is no such thing as an energy plant producer without cost. There's no such thing. And I just hope we'll keep, so I personally believe that the host community should vote, and we should go with that vote and trust the host community. But I just want to put this in perspective. You know, we're having this discussion about wind, and some people are against solar fields. They don't think they look good and the rest. We cannot move fast enough. We cannot move fast enough to get off of oil and move to other renewables. The 4 storms that I've managed are not coincident. The fact that the polar ice cap is melting faster than any science predicted, not coincidence. The fact that we have droughts in the Midwest that are leading to food shortages and milk prices going up in Vermont, tough on farmers, not coincidence. The fact that we're debating whether we're having the toughest forest fires, in the history of keeping track, not coincidence. This is a serious challenge. It isn't going to be comfortable. We've got to build renewables and start to find new ways to power our transportation infrastructure as well as our homes, or our kids and grandkids will have an unspeakably bleak future. It also means jobs and economic development. So I think we're on the right track. I think we should stick with it. We're not going to make everybody happy.
Mr. Brock, what do you think about the rights of people in the neighboring towns? What voice do they have?
I think we need to do a review of the Public Service Board policy framework regarding that. I do believe that these towers are of such size and of such magnitude and of such impact to surrounding communities that they must be considered and given more weight than they are in the present process. I've been all over Vermont, and I've talked to people from literally the top of mountains to communities that are impacted and affected by industrial wind. And overall, I've spoken with hundreds of people who feel they're not being listened to. They're not being listened to by the Public Service Board. They're not being listened to by this governor. And I think that's a problem. And we're moving headlong along this because of the belief that there is some crisis because of oil and coal-fired power plants. And simply stated, Vermont does not depend on this sort of power to produce electricity. We have probably the cleanest energy portfolio in the country. And the amount that we're going to add through the kinds of renewables we're talking about are infinitesimal.
Well, on this wind issue, I want to go to another question and remind listeners that we're listening to the gubernatorial debate on VPR between Randy Brock and Peter Shumlin. Mike in Plainfield recorded this question.
First wind operating on Sheffield Mountain is the first fully producing wind facility in our state. 10 years of its output has been sold. However, certain terms in the price or cost of electricity they make are under seal, not available to the public. One irony in this is that the public has heavily subsidized this facility, but yet is forbidden to know the costs and other terms they want to keep secret. Do you feel these sealed contracts should be open for public review? Thank you.
Mike also points out that 90% of First Wind's power output is purchased by Burlington Electric Department and Vermont Electric Co-op. Randy Brock, yours first.
I do support transparency, but I go beyond that. What I'm seeing in a lot of this renewable energy business is a situation in which ratepayers and taxpayers are subsidizing the construction of privately owned facilities. Facilities that, when once paid for, all of the profits associated with them will go to the developer. Now, in point of fact, when you invest in anything in the private sector, typically what happens is you as a venture investor, as a hedge fund, you're investing because you expect to make a profit. What we're doing now is we're having taxpayers and ratepayers make these investments and have absolutely nothing to show for it in the end. And what we are doing again is in the process enriching the renewable industrial complex in the process. I don't think that's right. I think we need to review the entire model. And if the ratepayer and the taxpayer is going to make an investment, I think they should have something to show for that investment in the end.
Randy just said, I don't think that's right. He's wrong. And he's right. He's wrong. The statement that the profits go to the developers is entirely misunderstanding how this energy market works in the state of Vermont. In the state of Vermont, this is a regulated utility. You have a regulated rate of return imposed by the Public Service Board and by law, and you can't make a profit beyond that number. So I just want to clarify that. Having said that, I agree with Randy. I believe in transparency. Whenever it's appropriate, I think that these details should be public. But I want to say a word about Sheffield. I challenge any Vermonter to drive up Route 91, to look at Sheffield, and tell me whether they think that that is a terrible project that's destroying Vermont's ridgelines. I was there for the ribbon cutting. I've been there since. It's a beautiful project. I was up in Lowell last Saturday. I think that project, in my own view, is aesthetically pleasing. So we've got to get this done. The statement that Randy just made, that we're not making any difference to climate change, I just don't get it. Of course we are. We are now going to move to, in my view, electric vehicles, other ways of powering our future. We can't move fast enough. It creates jobs. It makes good sense for the environment. It makes good sense for our kids. I reiterate, the storms that we're having are not a coincidence. Let's focus on the prize. It's climate change and a more livable planet. And anyone that tells me that a windmill is more destructive than a coal plant or an oil-fired plant knows something about the environment that I just haven't been told yet.
We had a question from Ann that you touched on earlier. What can you do to help Vermont shed its reputation as the most taxed state in the nation? So let's just have an addition to that is the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission recommended lowering income tax rates in Vermont by eliminating many deductions, things like the mortgage interest, charitable contributions, high medical costs. Is this a good idea, Mr. Shumlin?
Well, let's talk about the facts, because when we hear these broad statements, Vermont is the highest taxes, that doesn't happen to be true. Listen, one of the best kept secrets in Vermont, and maybe the world, is Vermont has lower income taxes for low and moderate and middle income earners than New York, our neighbors, than Rhode Island, than Connecticut, than the state of Maine, where Governor LePage is from. We have lower income taxes. We have high income taxes for the wealthiest Vermonters. That means $250,000 a year or more.
But what do you think about the idea of lowering rates and doing away with those deductions? Is that a good idea?
I think it's worth looking at and exploring for the simple reason that so many people look at tax rates from a superficial standpoint and don't really dig in, and it would allow us to look like we have lower rates, which is what many of the other New England states do.
Mr. Brock, what do you think of this idea?
The Blue Ribbon Tax Commission study was designed to create the ability to raise the same amount of money, but to do so with a different tax structure that cosmetically looks more appealing. I think part of the danger that we have to be aware of is the possibility that those in power, for example, looking for money to do things like fund single-payer health care, will look at a cosmetic change, kind of a fiscal fast shoe act, to lower tax rates by restructuring and renaming, but in fact raise more money in the process. That being said, the notion of moving to adjusted gross income from the method that we use now to compute income taxes might make sense. I think we certainly need to review the large amount of deductions and tax expenditures we have. We have a book that's probably 3/4 of an inch thick with all of the exemptions and tax expenditures we make that typically are caused by special interest groups wanting one benefit or another. And we always forget in this legislature that every time you give a tax benefit for someone to some group, you raise taxes for everyone else. I think the entire tax system needs to be reviewed. We need to review all three of our major taxes, get them working together correctly, and make a tax system that's simpler, that's fairer, and that's easier to understand.
Going back to health care, Joyce in Bristol submitted this question.
Everything I learned about the upcoming reform leads me to believe that groups of over 50 will benefit from reform, but the majority of employers like us who have fewer than 50 employees will not benefit, and our employees won't benefit. So can you tell me if I'm wrong? And if so, how will our employees purchase insurance, and how do we keep up with the changes, more importantly, and decisions that are being discussed and made every day?
Randy Brock.
Right now, as I look at what's being proposed for single payer, I have the same questions that my constituents ask. Those questions are, what is it? How much is it going to cost? What's going to be covered? How are we going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it? Can I keep my doctor? Can I keep my plan? And there are answers to none of these questions. And so I fundamentally come to the question of, look, how can you say you're going to save money when you don't know what you're going to spend? Essentially, I see this single-payer healthcare system with where we are right now with such a degree of uncertainty that I would say it's akin to driving a car at 100 miles an hour through a dense fog while blowing up each bridge we cross behind us. And I'm concerned about that.
I know that Randy wanted to give his anti-single-payer speech, but I actually think the caller was talking about Phase 1, which is the Affordable Care Act passed by Congress and has nothing to do with single-payer. And what she's asking is, Employers of 50 or less starting in 2014 have to purchase their insurance in the exchange. Larger employers don't. She's asking, is that unfair and don't we get hurt? And the answer is no. The Affordable Care Act is going to allow small businesses and individuals to buy insurance in the exchange. And the reason it's good news for Vermont is that we're going to pick up about $400 million of federal subsidies that we don't get right now. So it's a real help to small businesses to get what is a tough thing to pay for right now, which is the biggest challenge businesses face, which is how do you pay for health insurance? Biggest challenges that middle and low-income Vermonters are facing. It will allow the people with 50 or less to actually get a federal subsidy to help pay for insurance that they're paying for now. So I would speculate that it's going to help those small companies, 50 or less, and the individuals who are served by them, not hurt them. It's a good development.
Also on health care, Dr. Mark Logan in Rutland wrote us, several primary care medical doctors in our community are quietly pursuing licensure in other states or considering early retirement in anticipation of the changes to come. Are there contingency plans to address an exodus of primary care practitioners from Vermont? Mr. Shumlin?
You know, I've talked to so many doctors, both in Vermont and outside of Vermont, who say this, Governor, what I want to do in healthcare is to make people better. That's what we were trained to do. If you can develop a system that gets the insurance companies off our backs, that stops us being second guessed from the decisions we were trained to make by folks who are trying to deny coverage to people to save money. And if you can find ways to reduce our paperwork, make it a simpler place to provide medicine, and reimburse us better, because right now our primary care providers are being under-reimbursed in Vermont. We're losing them. We want in. So I can guarantee you that when people actually figure out what we're doing, I believe our providers will be thrilled. And I believe if we get this right, that providers from around the country will do just what they're telling me. Come to Vermont to practice medicine because that's what they're trained to do. Get the insurance companies, the bureaucrats off their backs. Let them be in a system that has choice, that provides quality care, and allows providers to do their job while getting good pay, which they're not getting right now.
Mr. Brock, what do you think?
I'm collecting letters from doctors all over Vermont who say things like this, and I'm quoting, "It's with great sadness that I must inform you that I will be closing my medical practice. I am not able to survive financially. Independent physicians are being squeezed out of business in the current medical economic environment." And this physician goes on to say, "It's ironic now. I came to Vermont in 1996 at a time when there was a physician shortage. It's now ironic that the political, insurance, and medical leadership in Vermont continue to say to the public that there will not be an out-migration of physicians due to the uncertainties in payment reform and that Vermont will not again have a shortage of primary care physicians." I see another letter from a urologist citing the uncertainties caused by state government's pursuit to be the first in the nation with single-payer health care. I'm not sure who the governor is talking to, but the physicians I'm talking to are telling me very different things. There is a problem. There's a problem in attracting physicians. There's a problem in attracting medical professionals who are concerned about the uncertainties. And there may be a reason that 49 other states aren't doing what Vermont is doing.
But those doctors are going bankrupt under the current system. That's what they're describing, Randy.
They're talking about the uncertainties caused by the state government's pursuit to be first in the nation.
Practice because of the current system.
The current system that she is referring to, it is ironic that the political, insurance, and medical continue to say to the public.
That's right. This system is driving doctors out of Vermont. The current
system is the uncertainty caused by where Vermont is going in its political environment, and that's what this doctor is saying. That's what the doctor is saying. The second doctor is saying as well.
We're going to move on from healthcare. We got a note from Carol in Burlington who writes, I work at one of Chittenden County's longest-serving preschool and child care facilities. For the last 3 years, we have received less and less state funding for children and families who clearly meet the financial requirements for some assistance. In a two-parent, middle-income working household, one parent is working for child care and little else. What happened and how can it be remedied? Randy Brock.
Vermont salaries, unfortunately, are not as high as they are in many states, and our salaries do, in fact, seem to be lagging. The percentage of our population that rely, indeed, on minimum wage salaries is among, if not the highest, close to the highest in the nation. Improving our economy in such a way that we create better jobs and better opportunities to get more money in people's pockets is the ultimate end result to solve this problem. State government has limits, and we every year have to balance what we do to ensure that we do in fact provide protections to people who are vulnerable and people who have needs. At the same time, we have to recognize the limits and the priorities that we have to set. And unfortunately, we cannot provide enough money for everybody, for everything at all times. But I think we do need to be careful. I think we need to balance what we do. I think we need to provide what we can, consistent with the resources that the state has. I believe we've been doing the best we can to do just that.
You know, one of the reasons I'm so excited about expanding early childhood education is for situations like that, like we're just described, because we know that private care is incredibly expensive. The second challenge we have is for folks who have subsidized care. Under the current system, there is a cliff. In effect, if you go get a job and you're unemployed, you go get a job, you're getting assistance to help you pay for child care and other features, other services, you suddenly hit the cliff and you find you're better off staying home. So I have been working together with Secretary Racine and others to try develop the first system in the country where we get rid of the cliff, where we develop a system where you are rewarded for getting work and you financially do better for getting work. So we have a two-track problem. One, to expand early childhood education so that everyone has access in a publicly financed system, the public school system, which is what I've been working so hard on. And second, for lower-income folks, to ensure that we have a federal benefits program matched with state benefits that get rid of the cliff right now, which discourages people from getting back into the workforce. Those are two things that we're working on very hard.
You've been listening to VPR's gubernatorial debate between Democrat Peter Shumlin and Republican Randy Brock, and we're going to wrap up the debate with one final question. Peter Shumlin, speak to the independent and undecided voters listening right now. Why should they vote for you?
You know, Vermont's the only state, along with New Hampshire, that's a two-year term. And when I ran for governor, I promised to get some really tough things done to grow jobs and economic opportunities for Vermonters. We're on track. We're making progress. And we're making decisions, I believe, tackling problems that other politicians won't or can't. My suspicion is that we're not going to see big changes in Washington, D.C. We could well end up with a divided Congress and presidency, White House, and more paralysis. It is more important than ever to have a proactive government in Vermont that's creating jobs, balancing budgets without raising broad-based taxes, but continuing to meet the promise of connecting Vermont to high-speed internet access by the end of 2013, developing the first affordable, sensible healthcare system in America, developing the best education system so that we have the employees. Our kids are trained to do the jobs of the 21st century. It doesn't necessarily mean a four-year degree after high school, but it means more training than you get in high school. And finally, a renewable energy portfolio that's going to make sense for the future and grow jobs and economic opportunities. We're making great progress. We have more work to do. I think we've proven that I can bring business practices, common sense, and tough leadership to state government to make things happen. I'd encourage you to give us another 2 years to complete the job that we've begun.
Randy Brock, why should independents and undecideds vote for you?
Right now, we have a governor who says he gets tough things done, and he does bold things. And the question is, are they bold or are they reckless? He says he gets things done, but Vermont Yankee, which was a signature item to get rid of, is still operating. He says that he wants to institute a single-payer healthcare system, universal coverage, but it is a system that after a year, a $300,000 study, approximately $100 million in expenses towards exchanges, the exchange, and other related activities, 100 people working on it. We still don't know anything about it, and we have no facts. And now we have the aftermath of the Tropical Storm Irene and serious questions about the handling of the rebuilding of the state hospital and the state office complex. I think people should focus on me as a change because I have the experience in dealing with hard subjects from the standpoint of a business person who knows that you have to make decisions that make sense. That having a state that becomes a laboratory for change in which you have your population effectively being lab rats at a grand social experiment is unwise and is not prudent. I believe that we need to focus on jobs, the economy, unemployment, and taxes. I think we need to focus on health care. I think we need to focus on the changes in energy, but to do it in a sound and productive way rather than a way that spends hundreds of millions of dollars of ratepayer and taxpayer money for something that is of a highly questionable end result based on their own statistics.
And we are going to leave it there. That will do it for our program this evening. I would really like to thank the candidates for being part of our debate tonight, Democrat Peter Shumlin and Republican Randy Brock.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
VPR's election debates are produced by Patty Daniels. The editor is Ross Sneed. Our production team includes Chris Albertine, Tim Johnson, Neil Charnoff, Kirk Carapezza, John Billingsley, and Jonathan Butler. The executive producer is John Van Hoosen.
Thanks as well to Asa Sordiff. Bob and I will be hosting debates for statewide and federal offices during Vermont Edition throughout the month of October. You can learn more at vpr.net and follow all of VPR's election coverage there. For Bob Kinzel, I'm Jane Lindholm. Thank you for listening, and good night.